Hello, I want to give you a little disclaimer before you start this video. This video is not any lesson or any teaching that I'll give you. This video is just a podcast about a chapter in our book. So thank you. If this audiobook somehow helped you, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you. Pastoralists in the modern world. In this chapter you will read about nomadic pastoralists. Nomads are people who do not live in one place but move from one area to another to earn their living. In many parts of India, we can see nomadic pastoralists on the move with their herd of goats and sheep, or camels and cattle. Have you ever wondered where they're coming from and where they're headed? Do you know how they live and earn? What their past has been? Pastoralists rarely enter the pages of history textbooks. When you read about the economy, whether in your class or history or economics, you learn about agriculture and industry. Sometimes you read about artisans, but rarely about pastoralists, as if their lives do not matter, as if they are figures from the past who have no place in modern society. In this chapter, you will see how pastoralism had important societies like India and Africa. You will read about the way colonialism impacted their life and how they have coped with the pressure of modern society. The chapter will first focus on India and then Africa. 1. Pastoral nomads and their movements. 1.1 In the mountains. Even today, the Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir are great herders of goat and sheep. Many of them migrate to this region in the 19th century in search of pastures for their animals. Gradually, over the decades, they established themselves in the area and moved annually between their summer and winter grazing grounds. In winter, when the How Mountains were covered with snow, they lived with their herds in the low hills of Sivalik Range. The dry scrub forests were provided pasture for their herds. By the end of April, they began their northern march for their summer grazing grounds. Several households came together for this journey, forming what is known as Kafila. They crossed the Pir Panjal passes and entered the valley of Kashmir. With the onset of summer, the snow melted and the mountainsides were lush green. The variety of grasses were sprouted, provided rich, nutritious forage for their animal. By end September, the Buckerwolves were on the move again, this time on their downward journey, back to their winter base. When the How Mountains were covered with snow, the herds were grazed in the low hills. In a different area of mountains, the Gadi shepherds of Himachal Pradesh had a similar cycle of seasonal movement. They too spent their winter in the low hills of Shivalik Range, grazing their flocks in scrub forests. By April, they moved north and spent the summer in Lahul and Spiti. When the snow melted and high passes were clear, many of them moved on to higher mountain. By September, they began their return movement. On the way, they stopped once again in the village of Lahul and Spiti, reaping their summer harvest and sowing their winter crop. Then they descended with their flock to the winter grazing ground on the Shivalik Hills. Next April, once again, they began their march with their goats and sheep to the summer meadows. Further to the east, in Garhwal and Kumaon, the Gujjar cattle herders came down to the dry forest of the Bhavar in the winter and went up to the high meadows, the Bugel in summer. Many of them were originally from Jammu and came to UP hills in the 19th century in search of good pastures. This pattern of cyclical movement between summer and winter pastures were typical of many pastoral communities of the Himalayas, including the Bhutias, Sarpas, and Kinnoris. All of them had to adjust to seasonal change and make effective use of available pastures in different places. When the pasture was exhausted or unusable in one place, they moved their herds and flock to new areas. This continuous movement also allowed the pasture to recover, it prevented their overuse. Some new words: Bhabbar, a dry forested area below the foothills of Garhwal and Kumaon. Bugyal, vast meadows in the high mountains. 1.2 On the plateaus, plains, and deserts. Not all pastoralists operated in these mountains. They are also to be found in the plateaus, plains, and deserts of India. Dhangans were an important pastoral community of Maharashtra. In the early 20th century, their population in this region was estimated to be 4,67,000. Most of them were shepherds, some were blanket weavers, and still others were buffalo herders. The Dhangar shepherds stayed in the central plateau of Maharashtra during the monsoon. This was a semi-arid region with low rainfall and poor soil. It was covered with thorny scrub. Nothing but dry crops like bajra could be sown here. In the monsoon, the track became a vast grazing ground for the Dhangar flocks. By October, the Dhangars harvested their bajra and started on their move west. After a march of about a month, they reached in Konkan. This was a flourishing agriculture tract with high rainfall and rich soil. Here, the shepherds were welcomed by Konkani peasants. After the Kharif harvest was cut at this time, the field was to be fertilized and made ready for the Rabi harvest. Dhangar flocks manured the fields and fed on the stubble. The Konkani peasants also have supplies of rice, which the shepherd took back to the plateau, where grain was scarce. With the onset of the monsoon, the Dhangars left the Konkan and the coastal areas with their flocks and returned to their settlements on the dry plateau. The sheep could not tolerate the wet monsoon conditions. Some new words: Kharif, the autumn crop, usually harvested between September and October. Rabi, the spring crop, usually harvested after March. Stubble, lower ends of grain stalks left in the ground after harvesting. In Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, again, the dry central plateau was covered with stone and grass. Inhabited by cattle, goat, and sheep herders. The Golas herded cattle. The Kurumas and Kurubas reared sheep and goats and sold woven blankets. They lived near woods, cultivated some patches of land, engaged in a variety of petty traders, and took care of their herds. Unlike the mountain pastoralists, it was not the cold and the snow that defined the seasonal rhythms of their movement. Rather, it was the alternation of monsoon and dry season. In the dry season, they moved to the coastal tracts and left when the rains came. Only buffaloes liked the swampy, wet condition of the coastal areas during the monsoon months. Other herds had to be shifted to the dry plateau at this time. Banjaras were yet another well-known group of graziers. They are to be found in the villages of Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. In search of good pastoral land for their cattle, they moved over long distances, selling plough cattle and goods to villagers in exchange for grain and fodder. In the desert of Rajasthan lived the Raikas. The rainfall in the region was meager and uncertain. On cultivated land, harvests fluctuated every year. Over vast stretches, no crop could be grown. So the Raikas combined cultivation with pastoralism. During the monsoon, the Raikas of Barmer, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, Bikaner stayed in their home villages, where pasture were available. By October, when the grazing grounds were dry, exhausted, they moved out in the search of other pastoral waters and returned again during the next monsoon. One group of Raikas, known as Maru, herded camels, and another group reared sheep and goat. So we see that life of these pastoral groups was sustained by a careful consideration of a host of factors. They had to judge how long the herds could stay in one area and know where they could find water and pasture. They needed to calculate the timing of their movements and ensure that they could move through different territories. They had to set up a relationship with farmers on the way so that the herds could graze in harvested fields and manure the soil. They combined a range of different activities, cultivation, trade, and herding to make their living. 2. Colonial rule and pastoral life. Under colonial rule, the life of pastoralists changed dramatically. Their grazing grounds shrank, their movements were regulated, and the revenue they had to pay increased. Their agricultural stock declined and their trades and crafts were adversely affected. How? First, the colonial state wanted to transform all grazing lands into cultivated farms. Land revenue was one of the main resources of its finance. By expanding cultivation, it could increase its revenue collection. It could, at the same time, produce more jute, cotton, wheat, and other agricultural produce that were required in England. To colonial officers, all uncultivated land appeared to be unproductive. It produced neither revenue nor agricultural produce. It was seen as wasteland that needed to be brought under cultivation. From the mid 19th century, wasteland rules were enacted in various parts of the country. By these rules, uncultivated lands were taken over and given to selected individuals. These individuals were granted various concessions and encouraged to settle this land. Some of them were made headmen of villages in the newly cleared areas. In most areas, the lands taken over were actually grazing tracts used regularly by pastoralists. So expansion of cultivation inevitably meant the decline of pastures and a problem for pastoralists. Second, by the mid 19th century, various forest acts were also being enacted in the different provinces. Through this act, some forests which produce commercially valuable timber like deodar or sal were declared reserve. No pastoralists were allowed access to this forest. Other forests were classified as protected. In these, some customary grazing rights of pastoralists were granted, but their movement were severely restricted. The colonial officials believed that grazing destroyed the saplings and young shoots of trees that germinated on the forest floor. The herds trampled over the saplings and munched away the shoots. This prevented new trees from growing. This forest act changed the life of pastoralists. They are now prevented from entering many forests that earlier provided valuable forage for their cattle. Even in the areas they are allowed entry, their movement were regulated. They needed a permit for entry. The timing of their entry and departure were specified, and the number of days they could spend in the forest was limited. Some new words: customary rights, rights that people are used to by custom and tradition. Pastoralists could no longer remain in an area if forage was available. The grass was succulent and undergrowth in the forest was ample. They had to move because the forest department permits that had been issued to them now ruled their lives. The permit specified that periods in which they could be legally within a forest. If they overstayed, they were liable to fines. Third, British officials were suspicious of nomadic people. They distorted mobile craftsmen and traders who hawked their goods and villages, and pastoralists who changed their place of residence every season, moving in search of good pastures for their herds. The colonial government wanted to rule over a settled population. They wanted the rural people to live in villages, in fixed places with fixed rights on the particular fields. Such a population was easy to identify and control. Those who were settled were seen as peaceable and law abiding. Those who were nomadic were considered to be criminal in 1871. The colonial government in India passed the Criminal Tribes Act. By this act, many communities of craftsmen, traders, pastoralists were classified as criminal tribes. They were stated to be criminal by nature and birth. Once this act came into force, these communities were expected to live only in notified village settlements. They are not allowed to move out without a permit. The village police kept a continuous watch on them. Fourth, to expand its revenue income, the colonial government looked for every possible source of taxation. So tax was imposed on land, on canal water, on salt, on trade goods, and even on animals. Pastoralists had to pay tax on every animal they graze on the pastures. In most pastoral tracts of India, grazing tax was introduced in the mid 19th century. The tax per head of cattle went up rapidly, and the system of collection was made increasingly efficient. In the decades between the 1850s and 1880s, the right to collect the tax was auctioned out to contractors. These contractors tried to extract as high a tax as they could to recover the money they had paid to the state and earn as much as profit they could within the year. By the 1880s, the government began collecting tax directly from the pastoralists. Each of them was given to pass. To enter a grazing tract, a cattle herder had to show the pass and pay the tax. The number of cattle herds he had and the amount of tax he paid was entered on the pass. 2.1. How did this change affect the life of pastoralists? This measures led to a serious shortage of pastures. When grazing lands were taken over and turned into cultivated fields, the available area of pastoral land declined. Similarly, the reservation of forests meant that shepherds and cattle herders could no longer freely pasture their cattle in the forest. As pasture land disappeared under the plough, the existing animal stock had to feed on whatever grazing land demanded. This led to continuous intensive grazing of these pastures. Usually, nomadic pastoralists grazed their animals in one area and moved to another area. This pastoral movement allowed time for the natural restoration of vegetation growth. When restrictions were imposed on pastoral movements, grazing lands came to be continuously used and the quality of pastures declined. This in turn created a further shortage of forage for animals and the deterioration of animal stock. Undeferred cattle died in large numbers during scarcities and famines. 2.2. How did the pastoralists cope with these changes? Pastoralists reacted to these changes in a variety of ways. Some reduced the number of cattle in their herds, since there was not enough pasture to feed large number. Others discovered new pasture when movement to old grazing grounds became difficult. After 1947, the camel and sheep herding Raikas, for instance, could no longer move into Sindh and graze their camels on the banks of the Indus, as they had done earlier. The new political boundaries between India and Pakistan stopped their movement, so they had to find new places to go. In recent years, they have been migrating to Haryana, where sheep can graze on agriculture fields after the harvests are cut. This is the time that the fields need manure that the animals provide. Over the years, some richer pastoralists began buying land and settling down, giving up their nomadic life Some became settled peasants cultivating land, others took to more extensive trading. Many poor pastoralists, on the other hand, borrowed money from moneylenders to survive. At times, they lost their cattle and sheep and became laborers working on field or in small towns. Yet, pastoralists not only continue to survive in many regions, the number have expanded over recent decades. When pasture lands in one place was close to them, they changed the direction of their movement, reduced the size of the herd, combined pastoral activity with other forms of income, and adapted to the changes in the modern world. Many ecologists believe that in a dry regions and in mountains, pastoralism is still ecologically the most viable form of life. Such changes were not experienced only by pastoral communities in India. In many other parts of the world, new laws and settlement patterns forced pastoral communities to alter their lives. How did pastoral communities elsewhere cope with these changes in the modern world? 3. Pastoralism in Africa. Let us move to Africa, where over half the world pastoral population lives. Even today, over 22 million Africans depend on some form of pastoral activity for their livelihood. They include communities like Bedouins, Berbers, Maasai, Somali, Boran, Turkana. Most of them now live in the semi-arid grassland or acid deserts, where rain-fed agriculture is difficult. They raise cattle, camel, goat, sheep, and donkeys, and they sell milk, meat, animal skin, and wool. Some also earn through trade and transport. Others combine pastoral activity with agriculture. Still, others do a variety of odd jobs to supplement their meager and uncertain earning from pastoralism. Like pastoralists in India, the lives of African pastoralists have changed dramatically over the colonial and post colonial periods. What have these changes been? We'll discuss some of these changes by looking at one pastoral community, the Maasai, in some detail. The Maasai cattle herders live primarily in East Africa, 3 lakh in southern Kenya and another 1 lakh 50,000 in Tanzania. We'll see how new laws and regulation took away their land and restricted their movement. This affected their lives in terms of drought and even reshaped their social relationships. 3.1. Where have the grazing lands gone? One of the problems the Maasai have faced in the continuous laws, their grazing lands. Before colonial times, Maasai land stretched over a vast area from North Kenya to the steppes of northern Tanzania. In the late 19th century, European imperial powers scrambled for territory possession in Africa, slicing up the region into different colonies. In 1885, Maasai land was cut into half with an international boundary between British Kenya and German Tanzania. Subsequently, the best grazing lands were gradually taken over for white settlement, and the Maasai were pushed into a small area, South Korea and North Tanzania. The Maasai lost about 60% of their pre colonial lands. They were confined to an arid zone with uncertain rainfall and poor pastures. From the late 19th century, the British colonial government in East Africa also encouraged local peasant communities to expand cultivation. As cultivation expanded, pastoral lands were turned into cultivated fields. In pre colonial times, the Maasai pastoralists had dominated their agricultural neighbors, both economically and politically. By the end of colonial rule, the situation had reversed. Large areas of grazing land were also turned into game reserves like the Masai Mara, Samburu National Park in Kenya, Serengeti Park in Tanzania. Patrons were not allowed to enter these reserves. They could neither hunt animals nor graze their herds in this area. Very often, these reserves were in areas that had traditionally been regular grazing grounds for Maasai herds. The Serengeti National Park, for instance, was created over 14,760 km of Maasai grazing land. The loss of the finest grazing lands and water resources created pressure on the small area of land that the Maasai were confined within. Continuous grazing within a small area inevitably meant a deterioration of the quality of pastures. Fodder were others in short of supply. Feeding the cattle became a persistent problem. 3.2. The borders are closed. In the 19th century, African pastoralists could move over vast areas in search of pastures. When the pastures were exhausted in one place, they moved to a different area to graze their cattle. From the late 19th century, the colonial government began imposing various restrictions on their mobility. Like the Maasai, other pastoral groups were also forced to live within the confines of special reserves. The boundaries of this reserve became the limits within which they can move. They are not allowed to move with their stock without special permits, and it was difficult to get permits without trouble and harassment. Those found guilty of disobeying the rules were severely punished. Pastoralists was not allowed to enter the market in white areas. In many regions, they were prohibited from participating in any form of trade. While settlers and European colonists saw pastoralists as dangerous and savage, people with whom all contact had to be minimized. Cutting off all links was, however, nearly impossible because white colonists had to depend on black labor to bore mines and build roads and towns. The new territorial boundaries and restrictions imposed on them suddenly changed the life of pastoralists. This adversely affected both their pastoral and trading activities. Earlier, pastoralists not only looked after animal herds but traded in various products. The restriction under colonial rule did not entirely stop their trading activities, but they were now subject to various restrictions. 3.3 When pastures die. Drought affect the life of pastoralists everywhere. When rains and pastures are dry, cattle and recruits starve unless they can be moved to areas where forage is available. That is why traditionally pastoralists are nomadic. They move from place to place. This nomadism allows them to survive bad times and avoid crises. But from the colonial period, the Maasai were bound down to a fixed area, confined within a reserve, and prohibited from moving in search of pastures. They are cut from the best grazing lands and forced to live within a semi-arid tract prone to frequent droughts. Since they could not shift their cattle to places where pastures were available, large number of Maasai cattle died of starvation and disease in this year of drought. An inquiry in 1930 showed that the Maasai and Kenya possess 7,20,000 cattle, 8,20,000 sheep, and 1,71,000 donkeys. In just 2 years of severe drought, 1933 and 1934, over half the cattle in the Maasai Reserve died. As the area of grazing lands shrank, the adverse effect of the drought increased in intensity. The frequent bad years led to a steady decline of the animal stock of pastoralists. 3.4 Not all are equally affected. In Maasai land as well in Africa, not all pastoralists were equally affected by the changes in colonial period. In pre-colonial times, Maasai society was divided into two social categories, elders and warriors. The elder forms the ruling group and met in public councils to decide on affairs of the community and settle disputes. The warriors consisted of younger people, mainly responsible for the protection of the tribe. They defended the community and organized cattle raid. Raiding was important in a society where cattle was old. It is through raid that the power of different pastoral groups were asserted. Young men came to be recognized as members of the warrior class when they proved their manliness by raiding the cattle of other pastoral groups and participating in wars. They, however, were subject to the authority of the elders. To administer the affairs of Maasai, the British introduced a series of measures that had important application. They appointed chiefs of different subgroups of Maasai, who were made responsible for the affairs of the tribe. The British imposed various restrictions on raiding and warfare. Consequently, the traditional authority of both elders and warriors were adversely affected. The chiefs appointed by the colonial government often accumulated wealth over time. They had a regular income which they could buy animals, goods, and land. They lent money to poor neighbors who needed cash to pay taxes. Many of them began living in towns and became involved in trade. Their wives and children stayed back in village to look after the animals. These chiefs managed to survive the devastation of war and drought. They had both pastoral and non-pastoral income and could buy animals when their stock were depleted. But the life history of the poor pastoralists who depend only on the livestock was different. Most often they did not have the resource to trade over bad times. In times of war and famine they lost not nearly everything. They had to go looking forward in town. Some eked out a living as a charcoal burners. Others did odd jobs. The lucky could get more regular work in road or building construction. The social changes in Maasai society occurred at two levels. First, a traditional difference based on age between the elder and warriors was disturbed, though it did not break down entirely. Secondly, a new distinction between the wealthy and poor pastoralists developed. Conclusion. So we see that pastoral communities in different parts of the world are affected in a variety of different ways by changing in modern world. New laws and new borders affect the patterns of their movement, with increasing restriction on their mobility. Pastoralists find it difficult to move in search of pasture. As pasture land disappearing, grazing become a problem, while pastures that remain deteriorate through continuous overgrazing. Times of drought become time of crisis, when cattle die in large numbers. Yes, pastoralists do adapt to new times. They change the path of their annual movement. reduce their cattle numbers, press for rights to enter new areas, exert political pressure on the government for reliefs, subsidy and other forms of support, and demand a right in the management of forest and water resource. Pastoralists are not relief of the past. They are not people who have no place in the modern world. Environmentalists and economics have increasingly come to recognize the pastoral nomadism is a form of life that is perfectly suited to many hilly and dry regions of the world.